Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and we are so grateful that you can join us. First hour, we're going to spend some time really just answering some of the questions maybe you have about your faith, about certainly your view of God, and some of the kind of difficult apologetic questions we sometimes address here on Point of View, because we want you to be able to articulate a biblical worldview and also be able to defend a biblical worldview. So we do want to do that. And of course, some of you may have comments or questions, or maybe dealing with people right now that are maybe having some of those kind of skeptical questions. So we really want to equip you in that regard. Next hour, we're going to get into some various issues in the news. We'll move from a variety of topics that are at the national level all the way down to a couple of stories I've posted, because we're seeing more and more evidence of unruly passengers on airlines, a complete decline of American manners, and a number of other topics. So we will not only just focus on some of the political issues right now before Congress and before the G7, but also some things that affect your day-to-day life. So I hope you'll stay with us for the entire 2 hours. But first of all, let me introduce the author of this book. Dr. Michael Brown's been with us a number of occasions before. The new book is called Has God Failed You? Finding Faith When You're Not Even Sure God is Real. He's the founder of Ask Dr. Brown Ministries. We have a link to that on our website, as well as the Fire School of Ministry in North Carolina. Holds his PhD from New York University. He's been on the program with us before, author of about 35 books. Really the world's foremost Messianic Jewish apologist as well, but also an apologist in his own right here, answering questions that many people have about their faith. So, Dr. Michael Brown, welcome back to Point of View.
Always great to be with you, Kerby. Thanks for having me.
Let's take on the title. You talk about that early on. Has God failed you? Okay, I remember the old hymn, the only thing God can't do is fail. So obviously you're using this in a provocative way because, let's face it, many of our listeners, or maybe their friends, family, co-workers, feel like God has failed them, or they're saying, where is God when I pray? Where is God when a tragedy has come into my life? And in some respects, that's the foundation of your book, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I'm writing for people who feel as if God failed them, who feel as if somehow the promises of the Word were not true, or the God that they believed in wasn't there. And if not for those people, so many of us have friends, family, loved ones you mentioned that feel as if God failed them. And as I was writing the book, I felt the weight of the pain of many of the people who've been reading it. It's as if I could see their faces in my mind's eye, and the tears and the questions and the agony. And I thought, yeah, let's go with a bold title. Of course, I, like you, know that God, being God, cannot fail. But to simply say that to someone who's not even sure if he's real, or who wonders if their own faith is real, or maybe God cares about others but not them, we've got to meet them where they are, hence the provocative title.
Well, and also early on, you talk about the fact that this is a problem that's always existed, but it's made worse because of our friends, and I put friends in quotes, the so-called new atheist. And you quote from Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and many others that we've talked about on this program before. And so they are out there as apologists arguing, if you will, for the fact that God does not exist. And some of these doubts, some of these concerns, the presence of evil, the unanswered prayer is just further evidence that God does not exist. So we've always had challenges to the Christian faith, but those have heated up a little bit in the last few decades, haven't they?
Yeah, there's kind of a perfect storm of things that have come together. Starting about 15 years ago, the books from the main new atheists that became national bestsellers. Dawkins' God Delusion is on religion lists as bestseller for month after month after month. Then you have just kind of a rising hostility towards God in a lot of the culture. To the extent the church has gotten politicized, then it makes it easier to target, God is some right-wing, white supremacist. All the stereotypes just trickles down. Then social media, the peer pressure, society going in a direction of radical gay activism, and if you don't support that you're a bigot. And then a lot of churches in America preaching a watered-down, compromised gospel that doesn't really bring people into a deep encounter with God. And it's a what's in it for me theology. So if God's not there when you push the magic button, then you walk away. So a bunch of things happening. And as Josh McDowell has pointed out, that arguments that he used to deal with in addressing college-age students, he's now encountering with kids who are 12 or 13 because they saw the video on TikTok, or they retweeted or they reposted the Instagram meme, mocking the God of the Bible as a Bronze Age God. They don't even know what it means. But all of this has happened, and for us to just think that we go on with life as usual and we get over this bump, no, that's not the case. People need to be helped and addressed right where they are. There really is a crisis in faith right now in America.
Again, the book is Has God Failed You? You can probably find it in your local bookstore. It came out last month, but we also have information about that. You mentioned Josh McDowell. He said Dr. Brown has done it again. I always appreciate his thoughtful research and helpful insights. This book is a gem. Robert Morris, who's also been on the program with us, talks about you being one of the great Christian apologists. And one of the other quotes that you use is from Dinesh D'Souza. He joins us quite regularly and oftentimes is sitting across from me. But I love his illustration that imagine two groups. One would be the secular tribe and the other religious tribe, and they have obviously different worldviews, but which one is likely to survive, prosper, and multiply? Because the religious tribe is made up of people who have an animated sense of purpose. The secular tribe is made up of people who are not even sure why they exist at all. And so in some respects, that's the theme of your first chapter because, or I guess it'd be really the second chapter, what if there is no God? Because that is certainly a problem for our atheist friends. They think that we have problems as Christians answering the questions, and I think we do have good answers to those questions, but they've got a bigger issue, and that is, why am I here? Where am I going? Does anything in life make any sense? So it's not like they don't have any philosophical or epistemological or teleological questions. We have some, but they have major ones, don't they?
Right. And what I want people to do that have wondered if God is real or have concluded that he's not there, to think through what that really means. Let's understand what that really means. If we are simply the end product, or at the moment the end product of a random freak evolutionary process, then nothing has meaning. Nothing has significance. There is no such thing as a problem of evil, because that's just what evolution does. And there's not even such a thing as evil. And if you look out at society and you see injustice and you say, that's not right, where'd that come from? Mm-hmm. There is no such thing as injustice when a lion eats a zebra or a spider catches a fly. That's just survival of the fittest. When something in you says there's got to be more, where did that come from? And I want people to think through the implications of concluding that God doesn't exist. I don't mean that we can create him or uncreate him, but think through what it really means. And if inside of you there's disappointment because you felt there's got to be more to this world and more to life, and you wake up in the morning with a sense of destiny and why am I here, and asking those questions, it's because God puts you here. That's the answer.
Dr. Michael Brown with us as we talk about his book, Has God Failed You? We have a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is Flag Day, and it's worth taking a moment to document its history. This holiday commemorates the date when the United States approved the design for its first national flag. When the American Revolution began, the colonists weren't really fighting united under a single flag. Most regiments fought under their own flags. So the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to create a unified fighting force, known as the Continental Army, that would fight under the first U.S. flag, which was known as the Continental Colors. The flag they created didn't last very long. It was composed of 13 red and white alternating stripes and a Union Jack in the corner. It was too similar to that of the British flag. George Washington realized that flying a flag that looked like the British flag was not a good idea. 2 years later, the Continental Congress passed a resolution stating that the flag of the United States should be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, and that the union of 13 stars, white in a blue field, represented a new constellation. There are many claims to the first official observance of Flag Day. One took place in Connecticut, another in New York, and another in Philadelphia. The latter claim is often given the most attention because the citizens there worked to get Pennsylvania to be the first state to establish a June 14th Flag Day as the legal holiday. It has a national observance. Pennsylvania is the only state that recognizes it as a legal holiday. Both Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Calvin Coolidge issued proclamations asking for June 4th to be observed as the National Flag Day, but it wasn't until August 1949 that Congress approved the national observance. I'm so glad that today we can honor the U.S. flag and American history. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation today with Dr. Michael Brown. Let me just mention that you may be listening to this and have some questions. You may know someone who does. And so let me just recommend that oftentimes we do make available to you ways in which you can pass this on. You can, for example, go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says listen, and that could be a podcast that you could send to someone. Of course, watch. You can watch it or else later go to the YouTube channel. And I think this would be very helpful. So you may know somebody you want to pass this on to. A little bit later, if you'd like to join the join the conversation and ask a question, feel free to do so. But I suspect many of you just maybe want to take some notes and sit back and listen. But Dr. Michael Brown with us. And Michael, for just a minute, I might just point out that early on in the book, you said, you've written quite a number of books over the years, dozens and dozens, and yet you felt very inadequate to begin to write this book because some of the issues are so personal, so weighty. And so even as we go through this, I hope people won't think that this is just a quick overview of some serious questions, but that's one of the reasons why you have a book that's 180 pages and has 11 chapters and allows an individual who's really thinking through these issues to dig deeper. And so that's, in a sense, the structure of the book, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And look, I haven't suffered through what many others have suffered through. I've never lost a child to sickness, lost a spouse to a car accident. I've never gone through months and months and months or years of questioning if God even exists. So as I was writing the book, I was asking myself, well, what difference can it make? What can I say that hasn't been said already? And yet I felt that the Word of God is true no matter what, and that the things that I have experienced at least have sensitized me. And then, when you have a heart of empathy, when you hear the pain and the suffering of others, it drives you to your knees in prayer for them. And there are literally parts of the book I wrote while on my knees. I was by the bedside, and I had my laptop on top of the bed, and I was kneeling as I was writing and praying and saying, God, you have to help, because these are life and death issues. If maybe someone picks up this book and they tune into your show today, and it just so happens they're desperate and they're wondering, is there hope? Maybe there's this little flicker of hope rising in their heart, or they're questioning, could it be that God is true and that what I believe through the years is true? And if we don't deliver the answers to them, they may just walk away for good. So if we come up with some trite little answer, it's saying to that person, I'm not taking your pain seriously. I'm not taking your questions seriously. if I just throw out, a little soundbite answer, it's an insult to the pain, the suffering, the depth of questions, the doubt. And I was getting ready to be on one Christian TV show to talk about the book, and one of the producers called me who had read it, and it really blessed me. He said, I'm watching a lot of videos of people who are, quote, deconstructing, and they're leaving the faith. Yes. And he said, your book really took their questions seriously, and I was so glad to hear that.
Well, again, I wanted to use that as at least a preface before we get into some of that. But one of those chapters is on prayer. Does prayer really work? And you know as well as I do, Dr. Michael Brown, that we have run into people over the years, because you've spoken at seminaries. I have as well. You've spoken on college campuses. So have I. And of course, just going and speaking in churches, you hear stories all the time. Well, I used to believe in God, but I prayed and there wasn't any answer. And God, the Father, made promises. He's given us directives. I prayed, and I didn't get the answer I wanted, so I didn't believe he exists. So what about this issue of prayer? Because in the stories that you have here, you have some incredible examples of answer to prayer, but this is one of those stumbling blocks for the individual that really wonders whether or not God has failed them.
Yeah, and for good reason, because there seem to be very clear promises. Ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be open. If you ask anything in my name, I'll do it. Promise after promise. You could say, okay, our child was dying of leukemia. We looked at the promises, we prayed, we believed, we were sure, and she died. Where was God? So what we have to do is say, okay, let's look at what the whole Bible says about prayer. Not just a couple of verses, but what the whole Bible says. And as we look at the whole Bible, we see a bunch of things. One is that prayer is not only about asking and receiving, but also about developing a relationship with God. A second thing that we see is that many times answers to prayer are delayed. The Psalms have, why have you forsaken me? And how long will I soak my pillow with tears? And the objections in the book of Job, the pain, why, where? So that's in the Bible. God's already telling you, hey, I see this coming. And then Jesus gives us a parable in Luke 18 that we should always pray and not cave in, indicating that many times we will be tempted to cave in. So you might say, oh, so it's just like a joke. He tells us to pray, then he doesn't answer and stretches us out. No. As we pray, we draw deeper in communion with God. That's the first thing. We grow in our relationship with him. Second thing, we will see answers, some of them absolutely miraculous. What you need to do is journal those. Never forget those. Make those into memorials, because that's indicating to you the reality of God and the truth of his promises. And then there are other verses about conforming our lives with God if we want our prayers to be answered. And then other verses about persevering. When you put it all together, you'll see, wow, I see that he did answer. I see that his hand was there, but maybe it didn't go the way I expected, but through it, I came out closer to God. Through it, I grew as an individual. My character was strengthened. So if we can understand the larger aspects and purposes of God, we'll see that prayer does work, but not necessarily according to our little theological presuppositions.
Let's also take on, and this is a difficult area, and I want to be very careful about the fact that a part of the answer to prayer is whether or not we're in God's relationship. Now, I don't want anybody to take it the wrong way and say because God didn't answer prayer, that means I'm out of fellowship. But you have in Psalm 37, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Or you just mentioned, of course, some of the words of Jesus. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. There are times, and I don't want to overextend this, but there are times in which we do not see an answer to prayer because we're not within God's will. Is that a fair statement?
Very fair statement. And of course, I treat those very verses in the book here. Let all of your listeners ask themselves this question. Would I really like it if every prayer I ever prayed in my life was answered?
Good. I like this.
Think of some of the things we've prayed over the years, or the premature nature of the prayer. God, give me this one to marry, or do this or that, only to find out that he knows best. So what I want to do is build such a quality relationship with God through prayer and the Word that I pour my heart out to him, that I'm honest with him, that I give him my questions. And there are times I know he stirred my heart to pray for a certain thing, and I'm sure it's going to happen before it happens, and sure enough, it does. And there are other things I put in his hands. Lord, what's going on? And I don't get this. And I thought this, and I thought that. And then I look back years later, I think, now I see it. Now it makes sense. So by all means, first and foremost, we submit ourselves to God, put ourselves in his hands. And if we have that solid relationship and a right understanding of prayer, and start with fellowship first, then we'll be amazed to see what flows out of it, because when we're in fellowship with him, he'll then lead us how to pray, and our desires will be in harmony with his desires. So rather than praying carnal prayers that James 4 warns about, we'll be praying godly prayers.
Well, let's take a break. And again, when we talk about prayer, you even have a whole section on the fact that if you look at the Apostle Paul, he prayed for churches and others. So it isn't just prayers for ourselves, but other kinds of prayers. But let's take a break, because the book is entitled, Has God Failed You? Finding Faith When You're Not Even Sure God Is Real. And we've looked at just a couple of the chapters, but when we come back, we're going to get into a couple of others. For example, what about this issue of doubt? Is it possible to have doubt? Of course it is. And what does that mean? What about maybe the fact that you even have a wrong theology? It is amazing sometimes when I'm engaged in a conversation with somebody, say, well, I don't believe in God. And I'll say, well, just for a minute, tell me what you think God is. And usually at the end, I say, well, your view of God is not the biblical view of God, so I don't believe in that either. And it kind of gets them to blink their eyes. And then what about these very important issues? Is the Bible an outdated book? Is the Bible a bigoted book? And of course, we also talked about this issue of the problem of evil. So this is a book that you perhaps can find in your local bookstore, but if you would like to get a copy, we also have a link to it so that you can get it in paperback and Kindle. Also, let me, during the break, encourage you to go to askdrbrown.org. We have that link there. You can find out more about not only this book, but so many other issues that he has addressed. You can find out where he's going to be speaking. You can get some of his other books, his digital library, and a number of other resources. So all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Dr. Michael Brown right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. Pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Michael Brown. The book is entitled, Has God Failed You? Finding Faith When You're Not Even Sure God is Real. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But Michael Brown, I thought we would also talk about askdrbrown.org. We have a link to that on our website. And you have information about your school. You have information about your talk show, as well as the digital library that's available. And I've oftentimes said that if you have a Jewish friend or family member, co-worker, neighbor that you'd like to reach out to, you are just really kind of the go-to place for some of those resources, given your background, but also given your interest in reaching out to the Jewish community. So what will people find when they do land on your website?
Yeah, if they go to askdrbrown.org, they'll find more than 2,000 op-ed articles that they can read for free dealing with all the cultural issues of the day. They'll find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of videos, actually more than 2,000 videos now that I think of it, from radio broadcasts to debates to sermons to cultural commentaries. And then if they click on Jewish, they'll go to a site that focuses on Jewish objections, debates that can be watched, information. So a lot of free material there, and then they can sign up for classes. They can order any of the 40-plus books that we've written. But a ton of stuff waiting for them. And just, you got a question, just type in what you're searching for. I bet a whole bunch of things will come up.
And again, lots of great resources there. And this one that we're talking about today, Has God Failed You? You can find it in your local bookstore. But again, we have links to that as well. And let's talk about doubt, permission to doubt. Now, Michael Brown, you know as well as I do, part of the problem is the church. I mean, I love the church and I love Christian leaders, but I know, and I've seen it happen too many times, where a young person asks a question in the youth group, and it's a question that deserves an answer, but everybody looks askance like, no, you're just supposed to have faith. You know, why'd you ask that question anyway? And so we're never given, as the title of your chapter is, permission to doubt, and yet you find doubt throughout the scriptures, and that is actually a very healthy place to be, because if you go and then research answers for your doubt, you will come with convictions, and then you'll be able to help someone else who also has doubt about a particular issue, won't you?
Yeah, and you're so right. It has been a failing in much of the church. There's actually a verse in Jude, have mercy on those who doubt. And there are other verses where Jesus calls us to believe and not doubt, or we're rebuked in James 1 for being double-minded. That's speaking to someone who should know better. That's speaking to someone who's seen God work, who's had relationship with God, and is being double-minded. Should I trust God or not? But the questions we have, how can God require you to believe when you're not sure he's real? What does he want? I mean, is that going to please him to just kind of shut your mind and say, okay, I'm just going to accept what I've been told? Obviously, he wants us to love him with all of our heart and all of our mind. And we need to create an environment in our churches where people can come with their questions and doubt and pain. I believe there are pastors who've been preaching for decades and all along have been hiding questions that they have, because who can they ask? And you mentioned, someone asks a question in youth group and they get shut down. I think sometimes we shut down questions because we're insecure ourselves.
Yes.
Because we're afraid when the question comes that, I'm struggling there myself. Don't rock the boat. Whereas when you're secure, look, I'm not a scientist, but I know you've got guys like John Lennox and or philosophers like William Lane Craig or these others that they know those areas, and Jewish objections I know. So when we are confident that there are answers, or simply confident in the goodness and truth of God and his word, we welcome them. I take calls constantly on my radio show on all ranges of subjects, inviting critics and mockers and skeptics to call. And it's not because I know that on every occasion I'm always going to have the answer, but I know answers are there. And therefore, there's no fear. I encourage people to dig out the doubts, the questions, the pain. And I wrote this chapter to say, hey, you have permission to do this. The novelist Dan Brown, famous for Da Vinci Code and other books, he claims he was raised in a home with a believing mother and a skeptical father. And when he started to have questions about the Bible and science, and he went to the priest of his church when he said he was 13 years old. According to him, the priest told him, nice boys don't ask those questions, and he walked out and turned away. And you see that hostility towards the church and the faith in his novels. What would have happened if the priest said, great questions, let's explore science and the Bible together? I wonder what Dan Brown would look like today.
Oh, so well said. Again, Jude 22, be merciful to those who doubt. A great verse, and I'm glad you pulled that one out. Let's keep moving, because you also have a chapter, perhaps it was wrong theology that failed you. You know as well as I do, Michael Brown, that we deal with a situation where sometimes people, because they have a wrong view of who God is, a wrong view of who Jesus was, a wrong view of salvation or prayer, that is one of the reasons why they feel God has failed them, because they don't necessarily have a biblical orthodox view of a particular aspect of the Christian life.
Right. If I just think that whenever I'm sick, if I pray, I'll automatically be healed. Whenever I have a struggle financially, I just give a certain amount and automatically I'm going to prosper. Whatever it is, this theology of God is somehow kind of our celestial bellhop, and we just press a button, get a miracle. Or we have no theology of suffering. We don't understand the role that suffering or pain or opposition may have in our lives, that when we experience these things, we just either we crumble or we think the whole thing isn't real, because if that's the way I was introduced to God, that this is what this message is, and this is who this God is, and this is what this Bible says, that when I push the button and it doesn't happen, I might throw the whole thing out. Now, of course, the easy thing to say is, well, miracles don't happen. There is no such thing as divine intervention, and God doesn't do those things anymore. But that wouldn't be true either. The truth is we live with certain tension in this world, because we do see God do amazing things, and there are documented healings, but the reality is most of the people we pray for are not healed, and most of the miracles we look to see don't happen, and yet some do. So I don't have a cheap answer there. My understanding is, let's have a truthful theology, one that requires maturity, and one that brings us in this world with a certain tension that we live, as some theologians say, with the already and not yet. God's kingdom has broken into this world. We begin victory over sin. We're transformed, and yet we still struggle with sin. We still struggle with issues in this world. The kingdom has broken in, but we haven't seen the full manifestation of it. That's why we see some things happen and not others. And often the issue is not God failing. No, wrong theology. That's what's failed us.
Again, the book is entitled, Has God Failed You? And I wanted to focus now on a very significant section of your book. There's both a part 1 and a part 2. Is the Bible an outdated and bigoted book? And this is another place where we focus on your strength, because in addition to talking about Jewish evangelism, I can't think of too many other people that have really dug deep into the LGBTQ issues. And so whether it's homosexuality, whether it's transgender, or a variety of other issues, we oftentimes see, Michael Brown, individuals walking away from their faith, even prominent musicians and speakers, because they just say, I just don't like what it has to say about sex outside of marriage, but in particular homosexuality or transgender issues. And so you focus some time and attention on that. How can we kind of think through that? Because that's an excuse we hear so often, isn't it?
Right. So you have some people that have struggled with same-sex attraction, and they tried to change, and they tried to become straight, and they couldn't. So they either walked away from God or rewrote their theology. But what's much more common is this perception that the God of the Bible is anti-gay or anti-trans, or is hateful and bigoted. And almost everybody these days either has a friend or family member, a colleague who's openly gay, and well, why does God hate them? Why are they going to hell? Because they were born that way. I mean, that's the way the world thinks. So what we have to do is really lay out Scripture and point out it's not about hate. It's not about rejection. It's about God's best. And as I was writing this, I was drawn to the book of Job. I wrote a commentary on Job and very familiar with the contents of the book. And I was reminded of when God reveals himself to Job at the end of the book. He doesn't just overwhelm him and bully him, but he he explains his beauty, his majesty, his wisdom in creation. And I start there. I start with ecology, that the ecology of that God causes rain to fall on plants and flowers in abandoned areas, because that's how meticulously he cares for this world. And then go from that to the creation of human beings and DNA and the wonder of it all. And then the male and female, he created us, and go through all that and say, okay, now, if that's the way he made it and set it up and everything has a purpose, is it hateful to say that there's something better than a transgender person having radical surgery, going on hormones for life to alter that amazingly made body? Or could it be that God didn't intend men to be with women and women to be with men? And I lay it out in such a way that when you see it differently, it's not a matter of hatred. It's not a matter of bigotry. It's a matter of, there's design behind this.
Yes.
There's purpose behind this. And then when we can harmonize our views with God's, we see his ways are best.
We'll take a break, and when we continue back with Michael Brown on this book, Has God Failed You? We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, Dr. Michael Brown with us. Michael, we were talking about, of course, the whole idea is the Bible outdated and bigoted. And, of course, I could add to that, is it anti-scientific? One of the reasons why we've had various people from the Discovery Institute and others on the subject as well, because some people say, well, it's just not scientific. But back to this idea of being bigoted, that gets us into one other issue that you point point out, and that is, if we are really going to love people, we need to warn them. And to take it out of the issue of LGBT for just a minute, if you knew somebody was doing drugs, you would want to warn them about the dangers of drug abuse, something that, of course, you know something about. And nobody would say that you're bigoted or mean-spirited by warning them that getting into the drug culture and having a life surrounding drugs is a good idea. You would be seen as loving by warning them of the dangers. Likewise, you point out some very significant physical, medical, and even psychological issues associated with LGBT. And by warning individuals, that's not being mean-spirited. That's really being loving, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And when you realize, if you read the book of Proverbs, if you live by the wisdom of Proverbs, on average, you'll live a longer, healthier life. When insurance policies ask you questions to determine where you qualify, and you get physical exams and things. Well, if you're not a smoker, if you're not a drinker, if you're not promiscuous and things like that, you're going to get better insurance rates. It's just understood because God designed us in certain ways. If you're faithful to your spouse, you're not going to come down with a sexually transmitted disease. If you're faithful to each other, you can have the exact same sexual act with someone you're not married to, but now you crossed a certain line, and now potential opens up for other issues. And one thing that I got into in these chapters about the Bible being outdated and bigoted, as I said, okay, let's say you're raising a kid in America today versus ancient Israel. In which society is it more likely that daughter of yours that you're raising would get raped? Or get a sexually transmitted disease,
yes.
or which would be more likely that there'd be, alcohol or drug abuse, or that your kid would be killed in a violent crime? You just go through things, and yes, there were very strict penalties under Old Testament law where God literally revealed himself on Mount Sinai. And of course, the New and Better Covenant in the New Testament does not, you don't have a death penalty for adultery or Sabbath breaking, and you look at the Bible, it's just outmoded. Well, hang on, that was a much more moral society. And a much more family-oriented society, and a society, if you wanted to raise your kids in a wholesome environment, you would do far better back then than today. And yet we look down our noses, 21st century Americans, we're so righteous at biblical days, and it's actually the reverse. The biblical authors could look at us and say, what kind of world are you living in? And you got the best-selling songs, with women in the most, despicable sexual language and constantly objectified, an epidemic of pornography, and we look down our noses at biblical morality. Something's funny there.
I think so. And I even love your illustration there. Just think about living with the Israelites or living with the Canaanites. And our world is a little bit more like the Canaanites than the Israelites. But since we only have a few minutes left, first of all, let me just again commend you for that chapter on what would Job say, and then also seek him until. It brings us back to something else, because Michael Brown, we've been talking about this in a sense for this outreach, that you could take this book or use some of these principles to help somebody that you know who really doubts the existence of God. But there's another aspect of that. There are many of our listeners today that believe that God exists, but they may not trust God. The other day, there was a pastor who was saying, I know all of you believe in God, but how many of you really trust God? So can you give us some ideas on how to maybe rebuild a relationship with God and build, and it says, a trust for God, so that we don't feel like God has failed us?
Yeah, so first, it's so important that you have your relationship with God. It's no matter if you grew up in church. It's not just a matter of, it needs to be a genuine personal relationship with God. And those who say, I had it, I feel like it's been broken, I want to encourage you to open your heart and let hope rise again. And then determine, okay, I'm going to take God at his word. He said he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. I am going to put one foot in front of the next and determine to just go after him and seek him. During the day, when I'm at work or when I'm homeschooling the kids at home, I'm just going to be a cry in my heart, God, I've got to know you. I've got to understand you. And then as we read the scriptures, Lord, enlighten me, take the veil off my eyes so I can really understand who you are. And then what you see to do, take a step. You don't have to jump in automatically and become a super saint, but take a step in the direction of the light, and then journal. Journal when you see the faithfulness of God. Journal when you see the hand of God. Journal when you see a prayer answered. Journal where there's a lesson learned or a scripture that's come alive. And then go back and rehearse these things. And then read testimonies from others, those who've been through the fire, those who went through crisis, those who've come out on the other end full of faith. And as you do, you'll begin to see the reality of God. You know, I'm serving him almost 50 years now, and I'm blown away at his faithfulness. I've been challenged from every front, from every angle of objection and attack, and I am amazed to see the faithfulness and goodness of God. And I might tell someone if I was struggling, I'd start totally honestly with God. God, I don't even know if you're there. Or if you're there, I don't know if you're good. Or if you're there, I don't know who you are. And I don't know how to find you. So help me. If you're really sincere, he will answer those prayers. And when he does, respond, and you'll be blessed.
And again, one of the things I love about your book is that you do talk about some of the journal entries and some of those great answers to prayer. So, Dr. Michael Brown, I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View. And as always, look forward to the next opportunity.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate your great work, Kerby.
Let me one more time talk about some of the resources that are available. First of all, you have, of course, the link to askdrbrown.org. There are some great resources that you can take advantage of, the digital library, which he mentioned, and the Line of Fire courses. And so I would encourage you to take some time to find all of that out. We've been talking about this book, Has God Failed You? Some people have actually said it's kind of like a first aid kit for seekers and strugglers and doubters. And so I think you will find that this is going to be very helpful to you. And maybe you're one of those individuals that started out in the church, maybe already had some kind of belief in God, but you've had kind of a battle over these last couple of months, maybe because of the pandemic or the lockdown or a number of other things, fear, pain, loss. You maybe said, where's God in all of this? Does God really care? Why haven't my prayers been answered? But also I recognize that some of you are listening in and you're saying, look, I really never grew up in the church. This is not really something I've been thinking about, but I'm also like the early chapter in this book, recognizing that Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and all these people, they don't have answers either. These new atheists basically say, we're just here as a cosmic accident. There's no good or bad. There's no right or wrong. There just is. And it's just the cosmic evolution taking place. And there's nothing that makes any sense, and it isn't supposed to make sense. And if you're wondering about why there's evil, well, it just is. There's no evil. There's no good. It's just the reality of an evolutionary product. And you're saying, I'm pretty sure there's something more than this. And there is. And that we can find in the Bible. But this book would be one very significant help for you as well. So one last time, the book is entitled, Has God Failed You? It came out last month. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. If not, we have a link to find it both in paperback and Kindle. If you'd like to listen to it again, let me just mention as well that you can go to our website and download a podcast if you'd like, or even watch it again on the YouTube channel and maybe even pass it on to some others. Let's take a break. We're going to get back into issues in the news right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View radio talk show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
But we're going to get into some of the issues in the news, and just a few minutes from now, I want to get into a couple of the articles I've posted. One about the unruly passengers. We are seeing an increase, an unprecedented rise in the number of disruptive passengers on airplanes. And so I want to talk about that for just a minute, and have posted this article from the Washington Post, but I've seen it in many other places as well. And a couple of weeks ago, I was going to actually use another article that I had seen on the decline of American manners, and so I finally decided to post that one and talk about it as well. Then we'll get into some of the issues in the news, and there are many. First of all, I've got a very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson on This Isn't Your Father's Left-Wing Revolution. Very well written, and in light of some of the conflict that is surfacing, for example, in some of these school board meetings, city council meetings about everything from critical race theory to the teaching of LGBTQ kinds of ideas. Want to talk a little bit about that. And the other day, of course, we talked about inflation, so I did want to get into this because there's a good piece as well that came out on how inflation hurts America's pocketbooks and how in some respects it is a very regressive tax on the poor and the impact that that might have as well. So those are just a few things I want to cover this hour, but also an open line. If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of your phone calls as well. But before we get into that, I thought I'd just give you a brief update on the whole question of the virus. Did it come from a laboratory? Did it come from the wet market? And there is something very interesting that has surfaced over the weekend from Sky News Australia. And I want to thank our good friend Jim Garrity for pointing that out. It was a video that was marking the launch of this level 4 laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, it's kind of a video that would stay on a shelf until somebody says, hey, wait a minute, Wuhan, let's go back and look at this. What's so interesting is it shows a video of bats being held in the cages there in the institute. There's even a scene of a scientist feeding a worm to a bat. And this is a direct contradiction to some of the things being said that there were no live bats in the institute. So this argument that any of this virus could have escaped from a bat to a human being is ridiculous. And the person that was actually making many of those comments last year was a man by the name of Peter Daszak. Now, you might remember, I've talked about him before, president of EcoHealth Alliance. He tweeted, for example, no bats were sent to the Wuhan lab for genetic analysis of viruses collected in the field. Goes on to explain why he says that is the case. Yet you can go now, as researchers have found, and find that there were patents that were filed by the Wuhan Institute for Virology for bat cages, that multiple accounts from the Wuhan Institute of Virology staff describe bringing in live bats into the laboratory for further study. And so it illustrates only so well that one more thing that was actually used to argue against the idea that the virus could have escaped from the institute now turns out to be false. Now, we've talked on previous programs about the fact that do we have, smoking gun evidence or silver bullet evidence that it happened in the Institute? No. But as we talked about, all the circumstantial evidence goes in that direction. And that's why I posted a piece last week by Andrew McCarthy, who's, of course, a prosecutor, and points out that oftentimes circumstantial evidence is the best kind of evidence because it piles up and more of it is piling up all the time. If you're interested, this is a kind of an interesting video that's apparently going to be out, and I'm sure you'll see it on some of the Talking Head shows over the next few days. They talk about more than 15,000 samples from bats in China and even countries in Africa when they were searching for the origin of SARS were actually brought in there. You have a video, which is kind of intriguing, of a bat hanging off the hat of one researcher who was wearing a mask and glasses, but no protective head covering. And it's kind of a cute and funny image of the bats. But all you have to realize is that one scratch from that bat potentially could infect that researcher with a novel virus that the researcher's immune system would not necessarily be able to combat. And so it's just one more example of the mounting circumstantial evidence that we have that indeed the virus may have indeed come from the Institute. Why is that important? I tried to explain that the other day, but it's worth mentioning again. We don't think that China is ever going to pay reparations to the world, but if we know it came from a laboratory, that would have helped us a long time ago to have figured things out. And even looking at the way the Chinese Communist Party reacted by sequestering the individuals that were infected in the laboratory, by closing off traffic to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, all the sorts of things that, to me, look exactly suspect as to the fact that they knew what was going on and they simply covered it up. With that, Jim Garrity also reminds us that it seems like every day we've got another article coming out dismissing this idea that the virus came from the laboratory. This one comes from a person that wrote in The Guardian and said there's only two choices, a lab leak or also that it may have come from nature. And he says, if nothing else, he says that you have a city with a population of more than 11 million, with a thriving wet markets, has millions of human-animal interactions every day. And so a city only has one single virology lab. So to argue that it came from the lab is ridiculous. Well, let me answer those real quickly. First of all, the city has two labs, not just the Wuhan Institute for Virology, but they also have the Wuhan Center for Disease Control. The argument that this was engineered, no, nobody's necessarily saying, some are, but this could just have been an accidental release, and it doesn't necessarily even have to have been engineered, although they were doing gain of function kinds of things. And then the argument that in order for this to happen, everything would have to go wrong. Well, no, not really. Simply a scratch from a bat, a bite from a bat, an improperly sealed mask, maybe waste that wasn't disposed accurately, sharp objects, spills, liquids. Has any of these people writing these pieces ever worked in a laboratory? I have. Ever had chemistry classes? I have. Ever had organic chemistry classes? I have. Ever had biochemistry classes? I have. And I'll tell you, accidents unfortunately happen too easily, even in very secure laboratory facilities. And there were all sorts of questions about the facilities there in Wuhan. So I did want to just mention that briefly because every single day there's just one more piece of evidence suggesting that maybe it came from the laboratory. That was something that was proposed 14 months ago, but the people that were proposing it back then were made fun of, and it was called a conspiracy theory. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory now. I think it's a very accurate assessment of the best data we have so far. We'll keep looking at it, but we're going to come back and talk about what's happening in the airline industry with unruly passengers. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is Flag Day, and it's worth taking a moment to document its history. This holiday commemorates the date when the United States approved the design for its first national flag. When the American Revolution began, the colonists weren't really fighting united under a single flag. Most regiments fought under their own flags. So the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to create a unified fighting force, known as the Continental Army, that would fight under the first U.S. flag, which was known as the Continental Colors. The flag they created didn't last very long. It was composed of 13 red and white alternating stripes and a Union Jack in the corner. It was too similar to that of the British flag. George Washington realized that flying a flag that looked like the British flag was not a good idea. 2 years later, the Continental Congress passed a resolution stating that the flag of the United States should be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, and that the union of 13 stars, white in a blue field, represented a new constellation. There are many claims to the first official observance of Flag Day. One took place in Connecticut, another in New York, and another in Philadelphia. The latter claim is often given the most attention because the citizens there worked to get Pennsylvania to be the first state to establish a June 14th Flag Day as the legal holiday. Although Flag Day has a national observance, Pennsylvania is the only state that recognizes it as a legal holiday. Both Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Calvin Coolidge issued proclamations asking for June 4th to be observed as the National Flag Day, but it wasn't until August 1949 that Congress approved the national observance. I'm so glad that today we can honor the U.S. flag and American history. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, once again, thought I would just for a few minutes spend some time talking about what is happening in travel right now, and in particular in the airlines, because my first article is airlines have seen an unprecedented rise in disruptive passengers. Experts say it could get worse. I hope not, because these numbers are really off the charts. When sometimes you read a headline, you go, okay, let me look at the numbers, and we'll get to those in just a minute. But Hannah Simpson saying it's unprecedented? Yes, it's unprecedented. Now, first of all, before I get into this issue, I will acknowledge that there have been in the past, and probably now even currently, some reasons for disruptive passengers. One of those is that sometimes you have somebody who is mentally unstable. Understand that. And it's sad that sometimes that happens in any circumstance. But the difference is that we've all probably been in a public building, in a store, a restaurant, something like that, where you just have somebody that's just not there. I mean, they're just maybe have some mental issues of some sort. And what you can do is go to a different part of that building, a different part of that store, or if they get really unruly, you can call for security and take them out. And if they're just really unruly because they're drunk in a bar, you can throw them out the door. Well, the bottom line is that when you're traveling on this tube, this aluminum tube traveling at hundreds of miles an hour, you can't do that. So I recognize some of this is due to an issue, which is a very sad reason for that. They are either mentally unstable or sometimes sometimes they're drunk, and that's not a good idea either. Their airlines now aren't really delivering a lot of drinks because of that. Sometimes you get a bottle of water, so that may be a better thing, but that's certainly one kind of issue that certainly needs to be addressed. But at the same time, if you want to eliminate some of the other reasons, mental issues, drunkenness, there's become a third one, and it's the issue of masks. And many of these have to do with whether you, on one hand, have people thrown off a plane because their 2-year-old won't keep a mask on. And if you can figure out how to get your 2-year-old to always obey you, you can write the next book on the terrible twos. But that's a challenge to itself. So sometimes there's an overreaction in that regard. But on the other hand, given the fact that it still is a requirement that you wear a mask, the people say, I'm not going to wear a mask, and they get really belligerent. Again, I think at least I want to speak to those of you listening that claim to be Christians. I'd say let's go back and look at, say, Philippians chapter 2, where it talks about do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. I have a booklet that we made available a long time ago on the politicized culture and have a whole section there on civility. And that particular section is actually preceding where then we see how Jesus himself was willing to humble himself and take on a human form. You can go to Matthew 5, we want to manifest what we see as the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. And so some of this has to do with the overreaction maybe on some individuals in the airlines, making masks mandated even for people that, like children that can't really wear them, or other belligerent passengers. But let me get into my piece because it illustrates the point. They said the headlines had barely faded after a Southwest passenger reportedly knocked out a flight attendant's teeth during an in-flight altercation when the next high-profile example of bad airline behavior emerged. A man was arrested last week after allegedly banging on a Delta cockpit door, demanding the plane land, and tussled with a flight attendant. In less than 2 weeks apart, these violent incidents, parts of which were recorded by other passengers, served as reminders of the conflict that experts say has risen to unprecedented levels over the past few months. The Federal Aviation Administration last week said that it received 2,900 reports of unruly passenger behavior since just the start of this year. Roughly 2,200 of those involved passengers, of course, did not comply with a federal mandate to wear a face covering. The agency identified potential violations in 446 of those cases and started enforcement action in 42. Those numbers have grown over the past few weeks. When the FAA released an update on May 24th, it had 2,500 reports of bad behavior with about 1,900 involving masks. Well, you can go through this very long list of those kinds of issues, and they're trying to get a sense of what's going on here. And part of it is that many travelers are starting to move around again, and you would think really after the lockdown that a lot of people would just be excited about getting out, but some of them have been resentful about being locked down. Some of them are defiant, and air travel, which always can be pretty stressful for some individuals, has just added that element to it as well. And then, of course, you have all sorts of other pre-existing divisions and concession. They notice some things from different regions. And so one aspect of this whole loss of civility and the coarseness of our culture can be seen in what is happening on the airplanes. But if you've been driving around, I've had so many people say, did everybody forget how to drive after the lockdowns? Because it's just been crazy the way people are driving around as well. And so this second article is one that I was going to address a number of weeks ago and then finally just kind of set it aside, and I thought I'd post it today because it's a piece by Brad Miner talking about the decline of American manners. And it really is a good illustration of how we have always in this country wanted to have a little more civility. Yes, there was a time, as this article points out, where there was one senator who caned another person on the Senate floor. But it's amazing how over the years, even with incredible tensions that have surfaced in the House of Representatives, tensions in the United States Senate, that very little of that has happened on the Senate. Now, again, I'm not ignoring, of course, what happened on January 6th, but the point I'm making is that there are really strong tensions, and yet, nevertheless, there has been a decorum that has been required where even if you're going to disagree, you say, well, I have a disagreement with the junior senator from South Carolina, or I would like to come in agreement of the senior senator from New York. Whereas if you have ever watched some of these YouTube videos from other countries, sometimes there are people hitting each other, wrestling with each other in the parliaments. And so we've always sort of had a little difference in terms of the way in which we've handled this. Well, Brad Miner reminds us that during the time in which Rudy Giuliani was mayor and even Michael Bloomberg, crime in New York City declined because they accepted what was called the broken windows approach to policing. I'll hold up this book because I talk about it in our book on criminal justice, because it was the idea that if you have one broken window and you don't fix it, pretty soon you have lots of broken windows. And so the broken window approach, which is the idea that instead of ignoring misdemeanors, we will prosecute misdemeanors, because if we ignore misdemeanors, felonies will follow. If you crack down on petty crime, sometimes big crime will be prevented. And once you had a change from, say, Rudy Giuliani and Mike Bloomberg to some of the things that happened under Mayor de Blasio, which not only said we're not going to prosecute some of these crimes, but we're also going to prohibit religious gatherings, which I think is one of the sources usually in the past for civility. We have that taking place. And so he says the American Republic was founded by, he says, gentlemen, and depends upon gentlemanly ideals for both its prosperity and posterity. Our republic, in fact, he says, is the gentlemen and ladies writ large. Societal civility is the extension and expansion of individual gallantry. It's all about, and ought to be about, balance and restraint. And so he reminds us that words like civility, civilization, civic, and civic, these are all words that come from the Latin root, which is citizen, and the idea that those are citizens who are refined. They live in the city. They have very kinds of manners that are applied. And once we have a society that is sort of thrown off this idea of God, thrown off this idea of moral absolutes, certainly thrown off the idea of biblical absolutes, no longer values graciousness and grace, you end up with the kind of society that we have here today. And this isn't going to be solved by encouraging everybody to go out and get a copy of Miss Manners and read it and apply it. In some respects, the answer can only be found in a religious revival, and we'll maybe talk about that sometime in the future. But I want to at least acknowledge the loss of manners and unruly passengers, and unfortunately more to come. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once Once again, if you'd like to maybe talk about manners, civility, a number of other things, open line 1-800-351-1212. I've got a couple other articles I want to get to, but let's take a phone call. We'll head to South Carolina first. WHBJ. Ann, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey there. I was just thinking about this as I'm driving, what you said about civility and how that has seemingly disappeared. And it started me thinking, we worship a God of order, not a God of chaos. And I'm an educator, and I started thinking back to my educational years. We were taught Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary procedure. And we don't do that anymore. And some of our students don't even know how to conduct themselves in a meeting, and they talk on top of each other. So they grow up to be adults that do that. And I know my husband is in a political position, and when he is present at town meetings, I had to quit going because I was just appalled at some of the behavior that occurs in those meetings. And he and I were just talking that there is no order to those kinds of meetings and gatherings. And Robert's Rules of Order, parliamentary procedure, they're gone. And maybe we need to bring those back.
And I think even the idea of respecting those in authority, it gets to our conversation we'll have in just a minute, that the left-wing revolution that Victor Davis Hanson talked about that used to be in the streets, now it's in the schools. And that is, well, we no longer encourage kids to pledge allegiance to the flag. We no longer encourage them to say Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones. We certainly allow them to engage in all sorts of almost anarchy. And then we're surprised that then when we don't teach it in the schools, and of course we haven't taught it in the homes, and of course there aren't as many kids going to church, that then we are surprised that everybody acts like animals out there in the culture. But if they've been told that they were a product of evolution, there are no right and wrong, it's just the force of power, then you end up with the chaos. And we need to bring us back to this idea of order, because as you said, God is the God of order, not chaos, and we need to teach some of these principles. And if we don't, we're going to see more of this kind of behavior and disruptive behavior, not less. So you are right on target.
Agreed.
Well, I sure appreciate you calling today, and hope you call again. Yes. If you'd like to join the conversation, that will open up a line, 1-800-351-1212, because I am convinced this issue of civility and order is very important. As a matter of fact, I might even do a booklet just on the issue of civility, because I only took a little portion of something that I did on that regard. And a while back when I was in Florida, I was preaching at a church, and somebody told me that I had preached there years before on the subjects of integrity and civility. And I remember that because these were two messages that I'd put together, and I pulled some of this from Stephen Carter, who was at Yale, and also some great material from a number of different preachers and things of that nature, Chuck Swindoll in particular, but pulled those together. And she said those were so good that I got multiple CDs and gave them to everybody that I thought needed them in the company where she works. Anyway, I think this issue of civility and the need for us to have some kind of order is important. And the point that certainly Ann was making is Robert's Rules of Order. We really do need to teach that, because that is going to be very important if you go to a precinct committee meeting, if you go to a senatorial meeting, if you go to whether it's the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, even if you go to a third party, they all use Robert's Rules of Order. And if you don't even know how that is done, or if you have a city council that's just catch as catch can, and there's no principles, and there's no moving the previous question, and there's no kind of order, we really are going to look more and more like a banana republic, and something needs to change. So I appreciate your reaction to that, because my first article is on the unruly passengers, second article on decline of American manners. I'll get to the third article by Victor Davis Hanson, but I thought I'd answer a question that people had last week. You might remember, if you happen to be listening to our Friday weekend edition, we had Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews, and we talked about inflation inflation. And this piece that just came out recently reminds us that if you look at the year-over-year inflation rate for May, it's more than 5%. So that's the largest 12-month increase since August of 2008. Of course, you might remember what happened in 2008, what a disaster that was. And you look at the hikes in food and energy, for example, those have gone up. I have a commentary coming out next week on how that's increased for commodities, for used cars, and a variety of others. And for example, used vehicles 29.7%, transportation 11.2%, commodities 6.5%. So those are, if you will, more consumer price index numbers, and I think those numbers actually are much higher, as I've talked about in previous commentaries, because the consumer price index is at least suggestive of inflation, but probably not as accurate. I was looking the other day at some of the material I've posted in the past, and if we used the way we conducted and analyzed inflation back in 1980, we would have 12% inflation. If we even use the examples we used in 1990, we'd still have 9% inflation. But this article reminds us that inflation is really just the erosion of a currency, in our case, the dollar's purchasing power over time. So a 12% inflation rate would mean that your dollars are only worth 98% compared to the way they are right now. But when you're talking about 5%, every dollar, if it's worth 5% less, and I think it's closer to 12%, but I'll take the 5% there, it's unlikely that most of you are going to see your wages increase 5%. So if you had maybe a job where you were getting paid $40 a year, it would have to be at least $40,000 a year. You'd have to be getting $42,000 a year. Of course, if it was $50,000 a year, it'd have to be about almost $56,000 a year if you really wanted to actually keep pace of what would be the inflation rate and a little extra. And that's just simply not going to happen most of the time. And so the final conclusion, before I take another phone call, is this. He says the effect is more pronounced upon poorer families, those who have more of their wealth saved in the form of dollars, whether in cash, checking accounts, or saving accounts, than wealthier families who are more likely to hold retirement accounts, property, or other assets that accrue interest or increase in value over time. Indeed, low-income earners typically spend a greater percentage of their money and their wages on food, fuel, and other basic necessities. And so what it does is very quickly illustrate the fact that you right now have an enormous wage gap between the rich and the poor. And what does inflation do? It increases that gap even more so. And so inflation is almost like a regressive tax on poor people. And so those are some of the examples that we wanted to use in terms of inflation. Well, let's take another phone call. And if you'd like to join the conversation, we'll head out to Stockton, California. And Edith, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for having me on there. I want to speak out regarding the rude behavior in our culture these days. And I am a conservative, and I have been a Trump fan, but I read my Bible, and every time he opened his mouth, I would cringe because the way he spoke had nothing to do with the way we're told to treat one another biblically. And then I would watch Fox News and each other and not allowing the other person to complete their sentence. And I finally had to just stop watching the news, except for, I just couldn't do it anymore. Just having, if you feast on the Word of God and you take it seriously and then you watch all of this stuff, it doesn't make any sense. And I would agree that not having these things taught in the school is problem. But when the children would go home and see what's going on in their living room, there's a great dichotomy between those two procedures. So
yeah,
that's
I think
all
you're right
I
on
have to
target.
say.
Yeah, I think you said it very well. And let me just, while we're going to a break here, just mention that the scriptures talk about that. Just talk about that as well. You think of the book of James, chapter 3. It talks about the dangers of the tongue. And how about Ephesians 4? Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear. And many of the tweets and many of the statements made by the former president, as well as some of the statements made by presidents before him and even the current president, as well as some of the talk show hosts and others, are all good examples of the coarseness of our culture and the coarseness of our language. So, I mean, there's enough blame to go around, and I think the bottom line is, let you not be one of those individuals with a coarse language. Anyway, we'll take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that our next article that we have posted here is by Victor Davis Hanson. Also, as a program note, let me just mention that today we spent a little bit of time talking about how to answer the questions of maybe you feel like God has failed you, and that's kind of an apologetic type of question. We're going to spend a little bit of time tomorrow with our friend Ken Ham. He's got a new book that asks the question, will they stand? And it's, again, maybe reaching out to the younger generation And so we'll spend some time with him. We also have another guest on the program, but we'll get into some of the other issues in the news. But just before we wind down today, I thought I would come back to this piece by Victor Davis Hanson. It's our third article, and it's entitled, "This Isn't Your Father's Left-Wing Revolution." And it illustrates with a great turn of phrase here and there something that we have talked about before here on Point of View. When Marlon Maddox was the host, and I would occasionally be a guest host or a co-host, and Penna Dexter was a co-host with him, we began to point out something we were noticing in the 1990s with the election of Bill Clinton, and that is some of the people that had been on the outside, kind of the revolutionaries, now they were on the inside. We saw the same sort of thing with the election of Barack Obama. I mean, he had been kind of a community organizer, a little bit of a radical, not a huge one, but many of the people he was around were indeed radicals, by the way, and all of a sudden now they were on the inside. And so what Victor Davis Hanson does is remind us of those who are on the outside are now on the inside. Pretty straightforward. For those of you that are a little bit older, those of you with gray hair or no hair, you might get a kick out of the first couple of lines. He says, the starry-eyed radicals in the 1960s and 70s dreamed that they were either going to take over America or destroy it. One of their favorite mottos was, change it or lose it, even as protests focus on drugs, music, race, class, sex, fashion, almost anything and everything. And so the 60s radicals, we're talking about, he says, long hair, wire rim eyeglasses, those telling us who was a drag, a square, a bummer, who was hip, cool, groovy, mellow. Those are some really old words. But with the Vietnam War winding down, the end of the draft in 1972, things kind of changed. And in some respects, he says that with the Reagan Revolution in 1981, that kind of finished off some of the people of the so-called Woodstock generation. They grew up. But that is still only part of the story, because in the second page of his piece, he talks about the fact now that the woke grandchildren of the former outsiders are now more ruthless systemic insiders. The woke and wired new establishment knows how to use money and power to rebirth America as something the founders and most current Americans never envisioned. He, for example, says, name one mainline institution that the woke left does not now control. The media, the campus, Silicon Valley, professional sports, the corporate boardroom, foundations, the K through 12 educational establishment, the military hierarchy, the government deep state, the FBI top echelon. I mean, it's a pretty long list. So then he goes on and said, look, the left has absorbed them all. But this time around, members of the left really can believe that by any means necessary is no mere slogan. Instead, it's the model for how to disrupt or destroy American customs, traditions, and values. Woke revolutionaries are not panhandlers, street people, or Grateful Dead groupies. They're not even a few nutty and murderous Symbionese Lebanese Liberation Army terrorists fighting against the man. They are the man. He says our 21st century revolutionaries are multi-billionaires with flip-flops, tie-dye T-shirts, and nose rings. I saw some at a conference the other day, by the way. But with absolute power and the desire to censor how half of the country communicates or to cancel them entirely. Here's his long list, and I'll shorten it a little bit. They don't flock to campus free speech areas. They are the campus administrators who ban free speech. They don't picket outside the Pentagon. They are inside the Pentagon. They don't chant, eat the rich. They are the rich who eat at Napa Valley's French Laundry. They don't protest uptight values because they're more intolerant and puritanical than any Victorian. They don't believe in racial quotas on proportional representation because they are racists who demand underrepresentation of bad racial groups and overrepresentation of good groups. The color of our skin is their gospel, not the content of their character. They are top-down revolutionaries. None of their agendas, from open borders and changing the Constitution to critical race theory and banning clean burning fossil fuels, are ever favored among the majority of the population. But their principle is never let a crisis go to waste. Only in times, he points out, of a pandemic, a national quarantine, or racial tensions can the new upscale leftist revolutionaries use fear to push through their policies that no one in calm times would stomach. Our revolutionaries hate dissent. They destroy any who question their media-spun hoaxes. Truth is their enemy. Fear is their weapon. 60s paranoid revolutionaries warned about George Orwell's 1984, but our revolutionaries are now 1984. And so he closed by saying, although this elitist leftist revolution is more dangerous than its sloppy 60s predecessor, it is also more vulnerable, given to obnoxious top-heavy apparatus, but only if the proverbial people finally say to their madness, enough is enough. So that's one of the reasons we do these kinds of programs here on Point of View. Over more recently, we've had various discussions on some of the topics we've just talked about: immigration, critical race theory, all sorts of other topics that now are simply dismissed as, oh, the people talking about these issues really don't know what they're talking about, when we actually many times do know what we're talking about, and they oftentimes will then say, well, don't believe your lying eyes, just believe what we have to say about it. And that, of course, is not working terribly well also. So I wanted you to have this piece. Victor Davis Hanson, of course, is a student of history who's at the Hoover Institute, but if nothing else, because of his background in classical education and because he's just a good observer of society and because he's a very good writer, I thought it might be a piece to help you understand a little bit more about what's going on. It's something we noticed a couple of decades ago. Those who are on the inside, now on the inside, and they're actually even less tolerant than we were tolerant of them when they were asking for a place at the table. Once they owned the table, nobody else was given a place. So I hope you will appreciate the kind of material that we have posted for you today on the website, pointofview.net. If you find yourself saying, I want to go back and listen to that interview by Dr. Michael Brown, you can simply go to our website, which is pointofview.net. There's a red button there, one to listen, one to watch. And so that might be something for you to listen to it again or to pass it on to others. Today is Flag Day. I didn't spend any time talking about it, but it's my commentary today. And if you'd like to know a little bit about the history of the flag and the history of Flag Day, well, that's my Viewpoints commentary. And if you click on the Read Now button, you'll see a flag that is illustrated, one of the first flags we ever had in this country. And most importantly, there's a place where you can click on the blue button that says Never Miss a Viewpoint commentary. So if you'd like to receive it in your inbox, we send you my commentaries Monday through Friday, and we also send you Penedexter's commentary on Saturday. It's free of charge, and it's just a way to educate you about some of the issues we've been talking about here on Point of View. I want to thank everybody who's been involved in this broadcast today. That would be Andrew, Elisa, and Ivy, and we hope to see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, Consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.